There's been a lot of talk about fairness on the news this week. Setting aside the political posturing and hypocrisy for a moment, it seems to me at least that people often seem to fall into one of two camps. This is how I've seen it described on social media. One, I had to go through it, so you should too. And two, I had to go through it, so I'll work to make sure you don't. I've sometimes thought of these two camps as those who are more focused on things being fair for themselves and those who focus on things becoming fair for others. It occurred to me that this idea resonated with my sermon topic this week. UU ministers will sometimes give sermons at the beginning of August, giving sort of a general overview of what Unitarian Universalism is. That's because it's not unusual to have people looking for a church to begin attending this time of year. Sometimes they've moved over the summer, and now that school is starting, they want to get their routines established. And this may describe some of you. Some of these folks like what they find here, are impressed with our commitment to social justice work, and like that we don't insist that they sign on to a rigid set of doctrines. They find the people friendly and the coffee tasty, and they sometimes even like the sermons. They stick around, but sometimes don't really know much about our history or theology. And that's one of the reasons we do the Inquirers series after each service, so that people can find out more about what Unitarian Universalism is and who we are. And sometimes people who have been here a while come just to find out more and have a chance to ask questions. So, while our lineup of guest preachers has kept me from doing one of these so-called Unitarian Universalism 101 sermons back then, I decided to squeeze this one in now because of a conversation I overheard after church a few weeks ago. In between services in Channing Hall, a member mentioned to a visitor that they wondered if the name Unitarian Universalism has run its course as a good descriptor of our current theology, mission, or even church communities. It reminded me that many people hear Unitarian Universalism and, having never heard the phrase before, aren't sure what it means. It really did happen to me again yesterday after the memorial service. Of course, the fact that Methodists are so named on account of the highly methodical habits of a group of students who met in Oxford, England in the 1730s doesn't really tell us much about the Methodist Church today either. Although it's pretty clear Baptists remain committed to adult baptism. But it led me to wonder, what effect do those theological positions that gave us our alliterative but lengthy name have on what we do here today? Is what we do so far removed from that history that we need to consider rebranding? Well, here in the United States, both the Unitarians and Universalists evolved from liberal branches of Christianity. If you grab your gray hymnal, and I realized later that either hymnal, you'll see a logo, two circles with an off-center chalice. And I realized there's one out in the foyer, actually, a big framed one as well. One circle represents Unitarianism, the other Universalism. And the logo was created when the two merged in 1961. So I and some of you are older than the Unitarian Universalist Association. The chalice and the flame were brought together as a Unitarian symbol by the Austrian artist Hans Deutsch in 1941. Reverend Charles Joy, executive director of the Unitarian Service Committee, asked Deutsch to create a symbol for the papers they produced to help Unitarians and Jews escape Nazi persecution. The Universalist Church of America had a logo that was a circle with an off-center cross. It was off-center to express that they believed that although they were Christian, there was room for everyone. When they merged with the American Unitarian Association, the logo with two circles and an off-center chalice was created. These two groups found each other because they were progressive and had common histories of having theologies out of the mainstream. I would go so far as to state that they were out of step because they were more in tune with the permanent, true expression of religion that transcendentalist minister and abolitionist Theodore Parker spoke of, than transient forms and doctrines. Unitarians, finding little if any evidence of God as Trinity in the Bible, held that God is one. In his influential 1819 sermon titled Unitarian Christianity, William Ellery Channing said, "We do then, with all earnestness, though without reproaching our brethren, protest against the irrational and unscriptural doctrine of the Trinity. To us, as to the apostle and primitive Christians, there is one God. And understanding God as three in one is more transient and less permanent than people realize. The doctrine of the Trinity came via a vote, yes, a vote, at the Council of Nicaea in AD 325. Universalists believe that all are saved, which leaves any discussion of hell trivial. Hosea Ballou, the influential early Universalist, in his book, A Treatise on Atonement, stated, "It doesn't make any logical sense for an infinite God to infinitely punish finite people for finite mistakes." Early Universalists advised, better get to loving your enemies now, because you're going to spend eternity with them in heaven. That's a scary thought. And no doubt one that people on social media today would label as wildly unfair. You mean I was good all my life and I have to spend eternity with those people? Both Unitarians and Universalists push back against the idea of original sin and that humans are inherently sinful and depraved. We believe humans are inherently good, but have a lot of work to do, both on ourselves and in the world. Ballou and Channing have been considered major influences on our faith. But I hear what you're asking. What does the theology of two white guys who lived in Boston in the early 1800s have to do with me, our church now, here in Houston? And more important, is there going to be cake again after the service? Well, you're going to have to wait to find the answer to the second question. But I've been thinking a lot about that first question since I overheard the conversation after church. I really believe that those early churchgoers' approach to theology is very much a part of our DNA today. Because they, like many of us, are suspect when told to believe something simply because that's the way it is and always has been. As Theodore Parker preached in our second reading, the great truths of morality and religion, the deep sentiment of love to man and love to God, are perceived intuitively and by instinct, as it were. Our transcendentalist foreparents emphasized subjective intuition over objective empiricism and believed that people can generate completely original insights. A core belief was in the inherent goodness of not only people, but nature. Thoreau's written account of witnessing the changing seasons at Walden Pond comes inevitably to mind, and I often quote Emerson, who said, "Why should we not have a poetry and philosophy of insight and not of tradition, and a religion by revelation to us and not the history of theirs? The sun shines today also. There are new lands, new people, new thoughts." 178 years later, Susan Frederick Gray, the president of the Unitarian Universalist Association, wrote, "We encourage everyone to bring their doubts and questions, their evolving systems of beliefs and spiritual practices, and the gifts of their own experiences and perspectives. We are lifelong learners, and all of these enrich our collective spiritual journey. All of this is to say, we do not place tradition and what was decided about religion before we were born above our own ability to think and reason and feel. We believe wisdom can be found in many faith traditions, and that our spirituality is too important to leave the details solely to people who died centuries ago. I suspect many of you, like I, feel a kinship to these folks in the past who pushed back against the predominant religious views of their time. A heretic is defined as someone who supports heresy, any belief or theory that is strongly at variance with established beliefs or customs. As I've no doubt mentioned before, the word heretic is derived from the ancient Greek heresis, and the English heresy originally meant choice or thing chosen. So we have been historically pro-choice regarding our theology. We believe that our beliefs and spiritual practices should and do evolve. The social activist, Trappist monk, and mystic Thomas Merton wrote, If the you of 5 years ago doesn't consider the you of today a heretic, you are not growing spiritually. And again, I hear you asking, all right, already, I'm like those old guys. I prefer to think things through, listen to my gut, and come to my own conclusions. But what in the blue blazes does the whole one God or everyone is saved business have to do with me, or really anyone in today's world? I'm so glad you asked. American Heretics, The Politics of the Gospel is a 2019 documentary that shows, according to their website, how a group of defiant ministers, congregations, and community leaders are challenging deeply rooted fundamentalist Christian doctrine in favor of a gospel of inclusion. Let me repeat that, a gospel of inclusion. One of the ministers featured is Reverend Marlon Lavenhar, the senior minister of All Souls Unitarian in Tulsa. In 2008, he made the bold move to invite Bishop Carlton Pearson and his remaining Pentecostal flock to join All Souls. Now, many of you know Bishop Pearson's story because he spoke here in this very pulpit. Well, actually, he walked around. He's pretty energetic. 3 weeks ago. In case you weren't here, check out our YouTube page. And let me read this from his bio. Carlton Pearson was a beloved Pentecostal Christian personality until he proclaimed the doctrine that declared that because of Christ, no soul will spend eternity in hell. Almost immediately, one of the church's rising stars became the most prominently titled heretic of his generation. So if you don't believe that believing that God is all-loving rather than judgmental has profound effects on one's life and career, even today, learn his story. I found it interesting that he came to his conclusions not by rejecting what was in the Bible, but by reading it more carefully. You see, heretics often come to a different conclusion by examining the very same source material. In the mid-19th century, Universalist preachers and their Orthodox counterparts actually engaged in formal debates. The Universalist preachers were skilled debaters who read their Bible carefully and knew by heart the passages that denied the reality of eternal damnation. I have found it profoundly sad that when what people consider Scripture points in two different directions, there are those who inevitably choose the more judgmental and divisive interpretation. I would again suggest that the more loving interpretation is what Theodore Parker considered the permanent, true expression of religion, a gospel of inclusion. And the more judgmental interpretation is a transient doctrine. It's not unusual when reading religious essays and articles, as I often do, for the author to refer to the triune God, as though the fact that God is three in one is established fact. But as I said earlier, that description of God was a result of a vote at the Council of Nicaea, when Constantine was trying to get a consensus of beliefs about his newly official religion. I like to think of the early Unitarians railing against the Trinity not so much about the number three as it was against any attempt to define an ineffable higher power. If something is far beyond our understanding, descriptions are invariably going to fall short. Three was just the most popular segmentation at that time and place. Had they been in ancient Egypt, I suspect they would have spoken out against the numerous deities described as representing the natural forces and phenomenon. As one of the few UUs at the seminary I attended, I argued in at least one paper that the Trinity is a really dandy metaphor for God, but is only that, a metaphor. To envision different aspects of an incomprehensible God as three unique entities may indeed be a useful way to understand how we as individuals may experience or relate to the divine. But it went well beyond that metaphor. After Constantine, the Trinity became doctrine, which means it began being vehemently defended by those in power. According to Episcopal Bishop and theologian John Shelby Spong, when any human group decides that they can define God, the outcome is always predictable. The true faith, once defined, must then be defended against all critics, and it must also then be forced upon all people, for their own good, lest their souls be in jeopardy. The writings of Michael Servetus included the first systemic depiction of anti-Trinitarian thought. In 1531, he published the book On the Errors of the Trinity, which really annoyed John Calvin. And the next year, Dialogues on the Trinity was published. Servetus was tried before the Calvinist Council of Judges in Geneva. He was found guilty of heresy on October 26, 1553, and was burned at the stake the following day at noon. Make no mistake, what people believe is very important to them. They are compelled to defend it. It is a carefully constructed tower that contains their worldview. I read recently of what the author referred to as a Jenga theology. People are afraid to reconsider any one of their beliefs, like that God is loving, not judgmental, or that God is too incomprehensible to be defined by a single description like Trinity, because once that block is pulled out, their entire worldview tower may fall in on itself. To read the Bible and consider that it was the prolific writer Paul who was focused on getting people into heaven, while Jesus was focused on getting heaven into people, might just pull out one Jenga block too many. So, circling back to my first comment about how some people being focused on things being fair to themselves, and some on making things fair for others. It strikes me that Unitarians, Universalists, and Unitarian Universalists tend to shift the focus from ourselves onto others, because we believe everyone is deserving of love and justice, including you. Unitarians, pushing back against the idea that there is only one way to define God, humble ourselves to the reality that our knowledge is limited and our experience is but one of many, and other people's experiences are valid. Universalists, knowing none are eternally condemned, tear down the us-them binaries to work for all people, including ourselves, because everyone is united in a divine soul. These UU values were important back then, and they're vitally important now. If these values were more widespread, we would create a more just, more equitable, and yes, more fair world. Let's commit to do that. Amen.